What do nuclear weapons, opera tickets, and David Hasselhoff all have in common? Well, we're gonna find out today. It was a physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain, a reminder of oppression, and when it came down, it brought the entire world, not just families, closer together. Don't believe me? Watch this clip of David Hasselhoff singing over the Berlin Wall less than a month after it fell. I've been looking for freedom. I can't sing this real song, or I'd get a copyright strike, and my channel would be gone. If that doesn't bring us closer together, I don't know what will. Today we're talking the Berlin Wall. Today there's gonna be quite a bit of German, so if I mispronounce things, which I inevitably will, sorry, I don't speak German on account of us winning the war. As the Allies grew closer and closer to victory near the end of World War II, they met together at Yalta and Potsdam to determine the future of their conquered enemy as well as the whole of Europe. It was determined that the Western Allies, specifically the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, would each get a portion of Germany. However, the Western Allies stopped at the Elbe River, allowing for the Soviets to conquer Berlin and take over the remainder of Germany. In return, the US, Britain, and France would each get a portion of Berlin as well, separating it into 4 separate zones. However, in the end, those 3, the United States, Britain, and France, would create West Germany, as well as West Berlin, and the Soviets would obviously be the East. As reconstruction of the demolished Europe began, cracks quickly began to show in the facade that was their alliance. The Soviets did not allow for themselves nor their newly conquered empire to receive any money from the American Marshall Plan. Even though the Soviets had received $11.3 billion during the Lend-Lease Agreement in World War II, which is over $200 billion in today's money, they continued separating away from the West, clearly showing that the alliance between the United States, Britain, and France and the Soviet Union was truly just an alliance of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. As Western Europe continued repairing itself and cleaning up after nearly endless amounts of war damage, the Soviets' now clear intentions of not giving independence to any of its satellites, but just adding them to their massive empire, created the conditions for Winston Churchill to state,
"From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Budapest. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere."
In only a few years, 20% of East Germans, which was 3.5 million Germans, would flee from East Germany into the West. Economic brain drain caused the Soviets to begin looking at different options so they could figure out how to keep these people there. Because after all, how are you supposed to create a workers' paradise if all the workers keep fleeing? The Soviets hated this little bastion of capitalist prosperity on a little island of West Berlin in the center of their socialist utopia. Their first strategy was to blockade Berlin, trying to starve the people into forcing the West to give up their enclave. But the joke was on them because thousands of Allied aircraft, as well as billions in food aid, and a President Truman who said, "We will stay, period." Showing that he would not back down, the Berlin airlift began. This blockade lasted for over a year. Endless amounts of Allied bombers to drop deadly payloads all over Berlin, day and night, were now dropping life-saving supplies on that same city. Beautiful irony was not lost on anyone, especially not then Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen, who, seeing the poor children who had absolutely nothing, was able to convince his crew to pool all of their candy together and create parachutes out of handkerchiefs and drop them from the airplane. Soon the idea caught like wildfire, and he could no longer afford all the candy he was buying. So it became an international effort, dropping over 250,000 parachutes full of candy down to those little children in Berlin. He became known as Uncle Wiggly Wings because he would wiggle his airplane wings as he flew past, and the operation became known as Little Vittles. Eventually, the Soviets, seeing that their bluff was called, ended the blockade and allowed for people and material to continue flowing in and out of Berlin. Khrushchev was once quoted as saying that Berlin was a fishbone stuck in the throat of the Soviet Union, which coincidentally was the excuse of the KGB when one of my relatives died in a gulag in Siberia. Well, that fishbone of the free West Berlin continued to get lodged deeper and deeper in the throat of the Soviet menace. As West Berlin continued to prosper and East continued to starve and die, cracks truly began to show. As West Berlin streets began to get clean, the economy of East Berlin was destroyed because Moscow had taken all of the machinery and industrial supplies back to Moscow as reparation, and there was nothing left in East Berlin but forced labor and bread lines. Eventually, the Soviets gave permission to the East Germans to create the Antifascista Schutzwall, or anti-fascist protection wall. Since the propaganda of the USSR at the time was that the Nazis had infiltrated the capitalists, causing them all to become fascists, which is the same propaganda that is still given out by UC Berkeley students today who don't have enough life experience. The first variant of this wall went up in one night by volunteers, forced labor. Many people woke up with secret police knocking on their door telling them that they could no longer live in their homes because it was now a no-go zone between them and West Berlin. In the early days of the wall, much of it was still barbed wire as they worked to create more permanent structures. However, it created the ability for scenes like this, where 19-year-old Konrad Schulman, a border guard, would leap over into freedom. He would from there move on over to a farm in West Germany and live for 30 years until the Berlin Wall fell, allowing him to finally see his family again. However, their reunion was not as sweet as he hoped, and they said that they had hated him for abandoning them in East Germany. Eventually, he sadly would take his own life in the 1990s. However, many stories would end up much happier than his. Such as one escapee on the day the Berlin Wall went up, Rita Schultz, who is a 77-year-old widow who lived on the border between East and West Berlin. Her building was the very last building between West and East Berlin. The street below her window was in fact West Germany. So she began trying to climb out her window. However, the Stasi were onto her. They grabbed onto her arms trying to pull her back inside. However, West Berlin bystanders grabbed her legs, causing her to become the rope in a tug of war of freedom. Thankfully, she won, and she would live the rest of her days in freedom in West Germany. A train engineer who knew while they had bricked over the tracks for the train, they had not removed the tracks in themselves. And so him and his family and friends, totaling 26 people, stole a train engine and smashed it right through the Berlin Wall, stopped at the next station into freedom. There was also Wolfgang Ingels, who drove a tank straight through the Berlin Wall. However, it got stuck. He climbed out and then got stuck further in barbed wire. He got shot 2 times. However, he was able to climb over the wall into freedom and recovered with a smile on his face. Many more escapes occurred, causing the East Germans to try and amp up their border wall to make it more secure and harder for people to escape. There are 4 total versions of this wall, the last of which being the most deadly. The end result was a massive no-go zone, as well as walls with rounded tops to make it harder to climb. Further, there were Czech hedgehogs, anti-vehicle ditches, sand pits full of landmines, dog runs filled with ravenous dogs ready to attack at a moment's notice, guards with a free fire order on anyone who was brave enough to step through, as well as spikes, an electric fence with an alarm, towers, tripwires connected to rifles that would automatically fire as you walked past, as well as barbed wire spotlights. Many people think of the Berlin Wall only going straight through the center of Berlin. However, in fact, it wrapped around all of West Berlin. Similarly, there was a border wall between East and West Germany as well. Eventually, President Kennedy would visit Berlin and he would say,
"There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin." And there are even a few who say that it's true that communism is an evil system, but it permits us to make economic progress. Lass sie nach Berlin kommen. Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us.
Look at Kennedy laying down the truth. He went on to say,
"All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner."
Which in fact does not mean I am a jelly donut. That is just a pop culture myth. He just had a silly Boston accent. Ich bin ein Subscriber. I am a subscriber. I can subscribe. Imagine waking up, you living on West Berlin, your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, your cousins, your friends, all living in East Berlin. There's a good chance you would never see them again. Weddings sometimes occurred within view of the other side. Those mothers would see their daughters be married, but never be able to hug them again. Some families would never get to see each other again, while others, the memory of youthful faces would be replaced by wrinkled ones, as families finally got to see each other after 30 long years. But the wall continued to separate people. Brave individuals continued their attempts into freedom, whether it be through hot air balloons, trapeze. Tunnels were a very popular option. However, they were also extremely dangerous. You see, the ground in Berlin is extremely porous and easily crumbled, and so those tunnels would often collapse. However, on top of that, The Stasi had listening devices throughout all the ground, as well as sappers trying to find and prevent them from escaping. Tunnel diggers often had to live in the tunnels for weeks on end because East Berliners did not have freedom of movement, and so people would be extremely suspicious of those people who were leaving a home covered in dirt. They would have to instead just stay there, working day and night, trying to just dig their way to freedom. They were not supposed to leave their neighborhoods, and there were spies everywhere. It was safest just to stay put and work. One of my favorite stories about tunnels under the Berlin Wall was the senior citizen tunnels, where old men dug a tunnel out to freedom, but they dug it not 3 feet tall for them to crawl through, but standing height, 6 feet tall. One of the men who escaped into freedom later said, "We wanted to walk to freedom with our wives comfortably and unbowed." You gotta love that symbolism. Another great story was that of 3 brothers, one of the coolest stories by far, and probably the deepest bond between brothers you can imagine. Ingo Bethik was one of the border guards who worked between East and West Germany. Well, one night, he snuck through the minefield, jumped onto an air mattress that he brought with him onto the Elbe River, crossing into West Germany and freedom. However, he wasn't done yet because he had to get his brothers to safety. However, his brothers were now under extreme scrutiny from the Stasi, and so they could not be seen talking to him. However, his brother Holger decided that he would take up archery. That brother got extremely good at firing that bow with a string attached to it. You see where I'm going here? Well, in a real-life version of Arrow or Hawkeye, he got up on top of a building one night. He fired his arrow with that string attached to it over into West Berlin. Ingo was there, attached it to the bumper of his car, and he took a zip line down to freedom. However, there was still a 3rd brother left, and so Ingo and Holga decided they needed to figure out a way to get back to him. They had no contact with him, and it was impossible for them to be able to communicate with him because the Stasi were watching him so thoroughly. So instead, they decided to take flying lessons. They were able to get a couple ultralight aircraft, painted them to look like Soviet aircraft with a little star on it and everything. One night they flew over to get their brother Egbert. They flew their little aircraft, landed near in front of his house, ran over, knocked on his door, grabbed their brother, who was extremely surprised to see them, flew him to freedom. Egbert, their brother, later said he never thought he would see them again, and they flew in like angels, bringing him to paradise. If that doesn't warm your heart, I just don't know what does. More escapes would occur, with armored cars, convertibles with their windshield removed so they'd slide right underneath barricades at the roadblocks. But one of the many times the Berlin Wall almost led us to nuclear war was in occupied Germany. The Allies had freedom of movement, meaning that the US, British, French, and Soviet forces had free ability to move between East and West Germany, East and West Berlin, meaning that US service members would often go over into East Germany because it was much cheaper and the dollar went much further. If you've ever been to a former Soviet bloc country, you would understand. One night, a service member and his date decided they wanted to go to the opera, and so they tried to drive through. Well, a Stasi guard tried to stop him, and obviously he said, "Screw you, you former Nazi, now communist." That made people really upset and created a real kerfuffle. Well, the Americans wanted to show that they still had freedom of movement, so they drove a parade of jeeps through East Berlin, which pissed off the Soviets to no end. So the Soviets brought forth dozens of T-55 tanks. The Americans, seeing what they were doing, did the same. 100 yards apart, these two armies stared down each other's barrels, waiting for war to begin. After a day of the tanks directly facing off against each other, back channels between the White House and the Kremlin were able to reduce tensions, were able to get the tanks back up. The agreement being that the Americans would maintain freedom of movement, but would not force the Soviets to tear down the wall. However, in return, the Soviets needed to back up their tanks first and not start Armageddon. Later declassified documents would reveal that Davy Crockett tactical nuclear weapons were on site and ready to be used at a moment's notice. These are the smallest nuclear weapons that American forces used, looking like this. They were basically a platoon weapon. They did remove them because they didn't want some sergeant starting nuclear war. As time went on, more escapes occurred. The Soviet system began to show more and more holes as their empire crumbled. As the decades continued, the only real difference was that the Berlin Wall kept getting stronger and more fortified. Eventually, another US president would visit the Berlin Wall, Ronald Reagan.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Mr. Subscriber, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Well, Reagan made major advances in pushing the Soviet empire to their limit. In the end, the Soviet socialist system would defeat themselves, as every socialist and authoritarian dictatorship ever did. But we're still getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's talk about the fall of the wall. Gorbachev, seeing the writing on the wall, metaphorically speaking, decided to try and loosen the death grip that the Soviet Union had on its people, hoping that to continue socialist oppression, but be grateful for the little bit of freedom that they'd clawed back. But instead, the people saw an opportunity to break their chains. Soon, revolutions throughout the Soviet Empire began, most of which were completely peaceful, such as the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, or the Singing Revolution, where millions of people came together all over Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, holding hands and singing. They sang for freedom, they sang for peace. These brave individuals stood up against oppression, and while it ended peacefully, it was not expected to do so. During that year, the Tiananmen Square massacre had occurred in China, another socialist country, as well as many peaceful protests were violently put down by the Soviets in decades past. Seeing these changes, the East German people began to get hopeful, but they were still scared because the East German government themselves was still extremely socialist. They saw these other countries, including saw the Kremlin, as weak, as not truly socialist anymore, and they wanted to maintain their stranglehold. However, Gorbachev was able to convince them to do minor reforms, one of these being Western-style press conferences. You see, in the Soviet Union, the press would receive the news and give it word for word and not be able to ask any questions or elaborate at all. However, with these new Western-style conferences, questions were allowed to be asked. And so one comrade, Gunter Schabowski, was going to have a conference. Now, he wasn't in any of these important meetings talking about immigration reform, but he did receive a small piece of paper that gave him some information. However, he didn't care about it. His press conference wasn't supposed to be about immigration. It was supposed to be about something boring like government-controlled grain prices or some other boring socialist thing. So he just stuck that in his pocket without reading it, didn't think about it again. Completely forgot that paper was in there. He droned on in his press conference and people started half dozing off. Eventually, they opened it up to questions, and so they asked him about immigration changes. Good old Gunty remembered that he had a piece of paper in his pocket. He took it out and read it word for word, basically saying that there was now freedom of movement for people who wanted to immigrate and leave East Germany. All of a sudden, the press conference was tense. Everyone was paying attention. There weren't snot bubbles forming in their mouths as they were sleeping. Instead, everyone was attentively listening. And they said, "When does this begin?" Gunter didn't know what to say. He realized he kind of stepped in it, but as far as he knew, it was immediately. Without delay. Within 15 minutes of this announcement, thousands of people were at every checkpoint around Berlin. On each side of the wall, people were ready. People were screaming. People wanted to be opened up and let through. The West Germans were screaming things like, "We have beer. We have women. My cousin Greta, she is single. We have Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. Come on over. Get to the chopper." Meanwhile, the guards had no idea what to do. They hadn't received any orders. They hadn't received any updates at all. When they tried to ask their superiors didn't know at all. In fact, the government of East Germany didn't want to have to call Gorbachev over in Moscow because they were a few hours later and it was kind of late. Not super late, just like a little bit late. And so they just didn't want to bug him. In the end, they decided to just kind of start letting some of the loudest and most annoying people through, hoping that would kind of calm down the crowd. However, as people noticed that the loudest ones were able to go through, people got rowdier and louder. And so more people came through. But as each person came through, they stamped their passport. What those people didn't know was that they would not be allowed to return to East Germany. Now, these people, they weren't defectors. They were just normal people who wanted to go snoop around the West. They'd seen it over there 100 yards away for decades and had never been over there. These people weren't trying to actually defect over to West Germany. They had kids, they had families, they had milk in the fridge or some sort of socialist powdered milk anyway. And so eventually these people started trying to come back. And what ended up happening? The guard said, "Didn't you realize what I was doing when I was stamping your passport? You're no longer an East German citizen. You can't come back." Well, this really started freaking people out. Meanwhile, at other parts of the wall, people started getting on top of the wall and dancing. Well, the guards didn't like this, so they decided to try and get out a hose. However, this fire hose was a socialist fire hose, which meant when they plugged it in and turned it on, it was full of holes. It was just spraying water everywhere. Good enough pressure wasn't there to actually push anyone off the wall. There was a guy with an umbrella that blocked all that water. Actually, at one of the checkpoints, a Stasi guard rushed down to his guard post to see what was happening. It was mayhem. He tried to call his higher-ups. They had no information for him. Eventually, he was able to get a hold of one of them who said, "I'll patch you in to a conference of my higher-ups. However, don't say anything. They don't know that you're here. So just listen." Well, as that meeting progressed, they asked if they could blame it all on him, if he was an idiot. Well, he didn't like that very much because he knew exactly what that meant. It meant embarrassment. It meant shame. It meant probably ending up in a horrible socialist prison. However, he knew something that they didn't. He wasn't sure about this, but he was pretty sure he had cancer. Not 100% sure. He wasn't able to get into the doctors. He'd been waiting for months and months to try and get in. It was a Soviet system after all. He thought he would be dead within the year. However, at the same time, he had inner turmoil because he was a loyal and proud socialist. So he got up in front of that crowd, he shouted them down, he got them to be silenced, and he told them, yes, you can go through. However, you need the proper documentation. The immigration office is closed. Come back in the morning when you have the proper paperwork. At that moment, a brave old woman raised her hand and she said, "Comrade, I have my papers here. Can I go through?" You see, she had decided to bring those papers with her. Everybody said that she didn't need to. They said Comrade Gunter Schabowski had said that it was all right, that you could just go right through. But she decided to bring those papers that she'd been holding for years, just for this moment. Well, that old Stasi guard, seeing those papers, looked at that old woman, looked at the crowd, and sighed. He said, "Fine, let her through." Upon seeing this, the crowd began screaming, begging, just wanting to be able to get over to West Berlin for freedom, for a chance to see what everything was about. He said, "What the heck, just let him through." And the crowd burst into freedom. Soon, a man ran into a bar nearby, screaming, "I'm the first, I'm the first." He received hugs, kisses, bratwurst, while his Germans danced around in their Lederhosen. There was a David Hasselhoff movie playing at a local theater. That theater stayed open all night, giving free tickets to every East Berliner that came in. It's another reason why the Germans loved David Hasselhoff. Another one being that he had just had a tour the year before, where he went and toured around, singing in front of the Berlin Wall. Well, after the wall opened, there was no closing it. The unification of Germany began. Within the month, David Hasselhoff would be back, singing from a crane in front of Brandenburg Gate on New Year. "I've been looking for freedom. I can't sing this real song. I'll get a copyright strike, and my channel will be gone." Still to this day, Germans love Hasselhoff for this. He even has a section in the Berlin Wall Museum dedicated specifically to him. Despite the fact that his piano scarf went massively out of style within the week, he would be remembered forever in Germany. Today, the Berlin Wall has been replaced with museums, monuments, parks, a beautiful walking trail. Instead of landmines, barbed wire, and death. The main lesson that we should learn from the Berlin Wall: those people came together. People from opposite sides of the political spectrum. Former Nazis turned capitalists and communists. People who are trained to hate each other and get ready for war and kill each other off. So the next time you're having an argument with a family member or friend, remember the Berlin Wall. Remember how an oppressor separated those two groups. They didn't feel that they were different from each other. But when that wall fell, they came together. They weren't capitalists, they weren't communists. They were Germans. They were humans. United. Danke schön for watching. Please share this with a friend. Like, subscribe. If you made it this far, just do it, please.